Good morning. My name is Jeff Phillip. I am on the Cedars UU Church Board of Trustees, and I'm here to welcome you on this lovely morning. I'll call your attention to one thing coming up in the relatively near future, and that is our Super Supper is on Tuesday afternoon starting at 4 o'clock, where we gather together with Kol Shalom congregation to feed the needy folks in the community. If you're interested in helping out, you can reach out to Mike Cox or myself, and we can get you connected to help out on Tuesday afternoon. Thank you.
I'd like to invite you all to just, as you're willing and able, to rise, to stand together, take a deep breath, and another one, to raise your hands, and exhale. And now, I want to invite you to turn to a neighbor near you and to take a moment to welcome each other into this space. It's good to see you.
You're my neighbor.
I know.
You get to sing next to me. You have a lovely voice.
It's good to see you in person. You know, I said hi. It's good to see you all. We are here together, gathered as a community, together no longer as individuals, but as one strong body. We are here. Welcome. Come, let us worship together.
Between 1971 and 1978, my parents rented a house on a quiet street in Everett, Washington. For me, this period of time included the school years, kindergarten well into my third grade year. I didn't know any of our neighbors, but I did know all of their kids. There was Donna, who was an only child. There was Dan and his older sister Nancy, Robert and his older sister Kim. There was the 5 kids in the Davis family. Robert and Dan and I were all the same age. The Davis kids always tried to get me to go to church with them. Robert often tried to steal my things and money. Dan and I was fine until we would fight, and that always ended with him kicking me in my privates and me running home crying. In 1978, my parents bought a house about 2 blocks away from the rental, also in Everett. Our neighbor on one side was an older lady who often lived alone, but then sometimes her granddaughter, Linda, would live with her. Linda was about a year younger than me, and all I really knew was that her home life was complicated. Her parents were separated, divorcing maybe. She sometimes lived with her mother, and I was never clear on why she sometimes lived with my neighbor. In 1983, Linda's mother gave her a little calico kitten. It was really cute. And the kitten was going to live with my neighbor full-time. Linda named the kitten Misty. But Linda's chaotic living situation was hard on Misty, and Misty eventually adopted my family. I don't know what happened to Linda. She simply stopped showing up at her grandmother's house. 11 years later, in 1994, I would drive out to my parents' house outside of Bellingham with my then girlfriend, Arlene. Misty still lived with my parents, and she would sit with Arlene, happily purring and drooling. In that house, my parents had a neighbor named Jim. My dad is good at talking to people. In a relatively short period of time, he can meet a stranger, ask them a few questions, and that stranger will tell him their life story, their deepest secrets, everything. Jim was pretty old, estranged from his family, and out of money. So he made a deal with my parents. He would sell them his house for a good price if he could live in it until he died. A significant arrangement for a person who happened to live next door. Arlene and I met in grad school. She was in the office just around the corner, my office neighbor. I confess to feeling that meeting someone in grad school is less random than meeting someone through proximity of housing choices. But I think the feeling is misguided. Perhaps I just spent more time with people in school than I did with neighbors. Maybe we all just attempt to create a coherent narrative of a planned and organized life using whichever people are accessible. Then we take what we've acquired, whether a relationship or a memory or a house or a cat, and we say, this is my life. It's like making a movie without a script with whichever actors show up at the set. Arlene and I now live across the street from Mark and Carol. During the pandemic, we would go over and sit at a big square table, share a bottle of wine, unmasked, and talk about politics and sometimes Mark's French girlfriend from 50 years ago who still calls sometimes. They don't have a cat, and we will probably never buy their house, even though it is very cute. I dedicate the lighting of our flaming chalice to that group of people who appear in our lives and we call neighbors. Please join with me in repeating our affirmation as printed in your order of service. As we come together to worship, we remind ourselves to treat all people kindly because we are one family, to take good care of the earth because it is our home, and to live lives full of love and goodness because that is how we will all become the best that we can be.
I brought one of my favorite mugs for my water today instead of my bright green water bottle. And I intentionally brought this mug because it is the Good Neighbor mug that the Suquamish tribe gives out to folks who volunteer and work with the tribe, which was an honor to receive and to be considered to be a good neighbor, according to someone else, not just my own assessment. So recently, I heard a story about some neighbors that I want to share with all of you. So imagine, if you will, a residential street. You know, houses next to each other, lawns, mailboxes, all the things you might have in your neighborhood. And there are two houses next to each other. One of these houses just got bought by a new family, and they're moving in. The other house had a family who had lived there for a long time, and they were a little hesitant about having new neighbors, but decided that they would give it a shot. The dad went out and started talking with the dad as they were unloading their truck and moving things in the house, and they seemed to have a lot in common. They both loved caring for their lawns. They dabbled in auto repairs and home maintenance, and it seemed like they were going to be good friends. The dad of the first family was relieved. Thankfully, some good neighbors. As the conversation was continuing there in the driveway, as the furniture was being unloaded, the dad from the second house, the house that was just moving in, said, "Hey, I have a favor I'd like to ask. It's going to be a few days before we can get our internet hooked up. And, we have our kids, and it would be really great if we could get hooked up and get them entertained somehow. Would you possibly let us use your Wi-Fi network?" Dad thought about it, and he didn't see any harm, and he said, "Sure, I'll let you use it," and gave him the password. And they went on their way. Family finished moving in. They never really even thought about whose Wi-Fi it was going from that point. One day, the two dads, again, are standing out in the front yard doing dad things together. And the one is talking, the family who moved in, with the other about this new show that he has been watching on Netflix. It's the best show ever. You have to see it. The first dad says, "We don't really have Netflix. I don't watch a whole lot of things, but, maybe you could lend me your Netflix login and I could watch the show." Well, hearing this, the wife of this new family came and said, "I don't really know that we're supposed to do that, and we pay for it, and, this isn't how Netflix is supposed to work." The conversation ended. The two families went back into their respective homes, and then suddenly, the new family comes out, knocks on the door, and says, "We don't know what happened. The Wi-Fi isn't working. We tried putting the password in, and it just keeps rejecting it." He said, "I changed the password. And I don't think that's how I'm supposed to be using my internet." The two went their separate ways and never spoke to one another in a pleasant manner again. The lesson I take from this story is that true relationships, true neighborly relationships, need to be based in mutuality. Love needs to be based in mutuality. Sure, maybe it's not a Netflix and Wi-Fi password, but when relationships aren't mutual, they cause harm. They can cause us hurt, and they can sever those neighborly bonds that we hope to create. And that is our story for today. invite you to take another breath with me. To bring your awareness into this moment. Each of us comes into this space today carrying things within us. Some are joys, some are sorrows. Whatever you bring in this space, in this time, may you find fellow travelers, fellow sojourners for truth and meaning to help us to carry these things. When we are hurt, may we find friends to be with us. When we feel alone, may we be reminded of the deep interconnected nature that we share. When the world is crying out, may we do our part to respond to the cries we hear with compassion and love. May a spirit of understanding flow from this time, from this moment, through each of us, out into the world, helping to transform, to create and recreate a new world, a new possibility for us to be in relationships, in relationship with ourselves, with one another, and with the world around us. May this prayer be with us in this moment and in the days ahead. May it be so. Amen.
On many Sundays, we set aside some time for the sharing of joys and sorrows. If you have a joy or a sorrow that you would like to share, please come forward, state your name, and in a few brief sentences, share your joy or sorrow. Pour a little water in the bowl so we all may be buoyed up by a joy, or for a sorrow, place a stone in the bowl so that we all may share your burden. As a reminder, this part of the service is neither live streamed nor recorded. When darkness deepens, we can still depend on cedars. When comfort flees, we can still depend on cedars. When change and decay all around we see, we can still depend on cedars. Can cedars depend on us? For without us, there is no cedars, neither spiritually or financially. If you are visiting for the first time, please feel free to let the baskets pass you by. You are our guest, and we are happy simply that you are with us today. Would the ushers come forward to collect the offering? Thank you for your gifts.
So, Eleanor Roosevelt once said that we should do something every day that scares us. And the wisdom in doing something that scares you, I think, is the opportunity for growth it provides. I don't think she meant go put yourself in danger's way or at risk in some way, make poor decisions, but to find those things that make us uncomfortable and try if we can just push ourselves a little bit farther and grow into that discomfort, to grow through that fear. One of my growth areas over the last several months has been improving my own musical abilities. And so today I'm going to do something that actually terrifies me. And I would like to offer a piece of special music that Meredith and I have been working on. This is a song by musician Holly Near and was adapted by Cliff Harding, who is a UU music director in Bethesda, Maryland. Holly Near, much of her music appears throughout the UU world over time and was actually at one point even the distinguished Ware lecturer at General Assembly. And I chose this song because I think that the theme that it offers really has a sympathetic vibration with the theme of neighborliness we are exploring. And so with that, we will now perform We Got This. I am open and I am willing, for to be hopeless would seem so strange. It dishonors those who go before us, so lift me up to the light of change. There is a hurting in my family, and there is sorrow in my town. There is a panic all across the nation, and there is wailing the whole world round. But I am open and I am willing, for to be hopeless would seem so strange. It dishonors those who go before us, so lift me up to the light of change. Lift me up to the light of change. Neighbors transform us. Relationships transform us. The people in our lives that we interact with transform us. That's what it means to be human, to exist, in my opinion. How many of you know your neighbors where you live? By a show of hand. You know your neighbors. Now, how many of you are close with your neighbors? How many of you have had challenging experiences with your neighbors? Yeah. Relationships transform us, but they're also hard at times. They're not always easy, and not every neighbor is the same. Over the last several years, I've noticed this trend on the internet, especially if anyone is on TikTok. I don't know if this is the right demographic, but if you're on TikTok, you may have seen some of these videos. There's thousands of them. Videos of neighbors getting in a dispute over something. Sometimes it's over where the property line is, where the tree actually is, whose property, who's responsible for it. Other times I've seen videos where there's altercations over parking your car in front of the wrong house, even though it's a public street. I know. I had a neighbor who did that once in a place I rented, and my landlord chewed me out for it. But sometimes these videos, these interactions that I've seen online, they can be a bit comical. Sometimes they're sad. Sometimes they're just a little bit absurd. And why are you arguing over where I put my garbage can when you can't even see it? But not always. There are times when some of these altercations, these disputes can boil over and become harmful. Earlier this week, one of these more serious situations happened in, can you guess which state? Florida. Sorry for anyone from Florida. One of these more serious altercations happened in Florida. Here's an extended quote from an NBC article describing the situation. A Florida man was arrested and charged with injecting chemical agent with a syringe under the door of his neighbor's condo. Police say an act of battery allegedly caught on video that was released this week. So they saw him on video doing it. Lee, 36, was seen injecting a liquid under the neighbor's family door at Oxford Place in Tampa Palms on several occasions. According to a police report, the liquid tested positive for narcotics, methadone, and hydrocodone. Methadone and hydrocodone are used to treat pain and have side effects and the side effects for both of these narcotics can include restlessness, stomach pain, vomiting, difficulty breathing, skin irritation, chest pain, diarrhea, hallucinations, and fainting, according to the Mayo Clinic. Many of these symptoms this family began to experience. It started when they noticed a strange odor in their apartment, and they tried to get it remedied. They went around trying to locate the odor, went to their landlord, and the landlord came and replaced every air filter, went through the apartment, and they could not identify it. This continued. Eventually, the fathers, a family of 3 with a young child at home, noticed that the smell seemed to be coming from near their front doorway. He thought this was suspicious. He cleaned up the area and the smell came back. Eventually, he thought to hide a camera outside of his front door in a potted plant. And that's when they caught their downstairs neighbor, a 36-year-old PhD in chemistry student, taking the syringe and injecting this substance along the threshold of the door. Not good. Not good. Apparently, the perpetrator of this event was upset mainly over noises caused by flushing toilets at hours when he felt toilets shouldn't be flushed. It wasn't like the noise complaints that I've sometimes had with a neighbor in an apartment I lived in where maybe they're being too loud, stomping around, and you kind of bang on the ceiling with the broom. It wasn't something like that. If you got to use the bathroom, you've got to use the bathroom. We can't control that. Not very neighborly. So I was one of those kids who grew up watching Mr. Rogers. You know, the guy, the Presbyterian minister, actually, who started his show singing, "It's a beautiful day in the neighborhood. It's a beautiful day for a neighbor. Would you be mine? Could you be mine?" This was the vision of neighborliness that I was sold as a child. I will admit, it wasn't necessarily my experience with the neighbors where I grew up. I lived in an area that it was mostly people whose summer cabins, they would come down to the beach for the summer. We never saw our neighbors except for 2 weeks a year, here or there, if it was the same people coming back. But this vision that Mr. Rogers offered was something that I longed for. This tight-knit community where people know each other. And I'll be honest, I still long for that connection. A world where people living near each other are in mutual relationship of support, companionship, assistance, and care. Unfortunately, this kind of neighborly relationship isn't as easy as singing a song. Some of us have expressed sometimes we have difficulties with our neighbors. As Gregory mentioned, the relationship between neighbors is kind of an interesting one. It's one of those relationships like familial relationships that you don't really get to choose. I know there are outliers. There are people who intentionally move next door to each other or build houses or any of that. But for the most part, who ends up being your neighbor is really a roll of the dice. Who knows? You might end up being neighbors with the governor. I never thought really that much about neighbors until I moved to Suquamish, where I live now. As I mentioned, in college I rented, and kind of year to year moving places, people are coming and going. There was an anonymity. There was a time for a brief period living in California where we rented a house and did get to know our neighbors and are still close friends with them. But for the most part, it wasn't until we bought our house and moved to Suquamish that I really started paying attention to my relationships with the people living near me. So where we live now, it's one of those streets that everyone knows everyone. We don't always get along, and not everyone likes people, and there is some drama between a few others, but for the most part, we all know each other. We're the sort of neighbors that hang out in the yard and barbecue together. They were a godsend during the height of quarantine when we weren't going anywhere, but you could go and hang out with the neighbors in the yard. We barbecue, play basketball, house sit for each other, run errands, and just hang out. So I mentioned, not everyone participates in all of these neighborly interactions, but it's not because they weren't invited or excluded. They are welcome. If you had told me this is how things would be when I first moved into where I live, I'll be honest, I would have been very skeptical. Not because I think that I would be a bad neighbor, but because of something that happened when we came to do our home inspection. Here's what happened. So Patty Shannon, one of our former members here at Cedars, was my real estate agent. And Patty, initially we had started out looking at rental properties. And the rental inventory in general in Kitsap County and really many places in this nation is low. Rental properties are hard to come by, and even if you secure one, you're at the whims of a landlord as to how that rent will increase or decrease, if it ever decreases. I don't know that happens. You're at the whims, will this lease be renewed? And we initially thought that was the route that we were going down. But somewhere in this process of getting ready to relocate, just out of curiosity, we went online and we found a house. One house that I thought, I think we could afford this. As a millennial, homeownership isn't something most of us are able to achieve, and I'm really grateful for that, to be honest. And I feel it was a wise move in terms of securing the price that we pay monthly on a mortgage, not having that instability of lease renewals, all of that, and I'm so grateful. Here's the sort of weird part about it, though, is as we found this house, and Patty and I were talking, and we decided, well, let's move in this direction instead. We moved forward and actually chose to put an offer in on the house before we had ever physically seen it. I know that's scary, and thankfully it has worked out. Patty was great, and I remember she, on FaceTime, did this extensive walkthrough with her cell phone, taking me, showing me grout in the bathroom, opening cabinets, opening the washer and dryer, like all of it. She was great. And she said, well, if you think this is the place, I would suggest put an offer in before someone else, and we can always finagle some paperwork such that you'll be able to back out if you change your mind. So we did. A week later, I flew up on my own to do the inspection. We met with the inspector, Patty, and her assistant at the property. Everything looked great from first sight. As we start to open the door, a woman across the street comes out dragging an axe. I'm going to kill you, she says. I will burn your house down while you're sleeping, she said. I forgot to mention my mother-in-law also came over from Kirkland to be there, and this sort of behavior is not something she is used to, and was very, very concerned. I remember turning to her and saying, "Don't worry, she's fronting." I've worked with people with mental health struggles. I know many of you have heard about my time working at the San Francisco Night Ministry, where we worked primarily with houseless people, many of whom are struggling with mental health issues that are unmedicated, substance abuse, not to mention all of the stress, the post-traumatic stress that comes from living on the streets. I believe there's a study once that said after 6 months of someone being homeless, living on the streets or in shelters, that oftentimes the post-traumatic stress symptoms they experience require years of undoing. And in many cases, people are not able to work through them. And when I saw this woman dragging her axe, threatening us, that's what I saw. I saw someone in a mental health crisis. And I'll be honest, the other part of this that made it not so scary is she could barely lift the axe. We moved forward with the purchase of our house, and at first we were kind of a little, I don't really want to engage with her, but in time, eventually, she reached out to us. She came over one day and knocked on the door and handed us a card. And it said, and she said, and in the card also said, that she was sorry for what she had done. She had hoped to be able to buy the house herself. She had hoped to be able to buy the house so that way her daughter-in-law could live there with her grandkids and to help in a caretaker role with her. Unfortunately, finances are fickle and she couldn't pull it off, and we happened to be the ones who made the offer. It wasn't personal towards us. It was something internally that she was struggling with. And I remember that day she said, "You are great neighbors. I see the way that you have been interacting with the kids, the way that everyone is congregating in your yard, and I wanted to say sorry." It hasn't all been rose-colored glasses since then. Mental health is complex, and she is someone who continues to struggle. Earlier this summer, some other individuals took advantage of this woman by squatting in her yard. In the middle of the night, some travel trailers were moved in. At first, we kind of said, "Hey, it's none of our business. If you have those trailers over there." But soon, the cars start coming and going. 4 a.m, music is blaring, and eventually it rose to the point where we finally went over to talk with our neighbor. We waited to call the police. We figured it was best to approach her directly first and see what was going on. That's when she told us she didn't want these people here. They had moved their trailers in without her permission, and she had been trying to get them to leave, but unless she filed an eviction notice, she wasn't able to get them removed from the property. The problem is, evicting someone is also a very hard thing to do, and it's not something that should be done lightly anyway, but it's challenging. And to be honest, we realized soon that this woman didn't have the wherewithal to go through the process. Elliot was home for the summer and decided that he would help in the way that he could. We contacted the Suquamish police, who put us in touch with the county sheriff, who would handle a matter like this. And they encouraged us to go to the Kitsap County Courthouse and file an adult protective order for a vulnerable adult. And so that's what Elliot did. 2 days later, the sheriff came and served the squatters their what was a restraining order, a temporary restraining order paper. They were allowed to remove their trailers from the property and haven't been back since. This was a few weeks ago, and it's been much quieter on our street. And the reality is, I know this probably won't be the last time there's some sort of issue like this with our neighbor. It wasn't the first, and it probably won't be the last. But as I said, I see her as someone who is going through something personal that is frankly a matter of brain chemistry. I don't think that it's intentional. I don't think that she's trying to be a bad neighbor. And so to the degree that we can, we have decided, along with some other neighbors, we will be available and help out according to the capacity that we have. Not every day I have that capacity. There was a time before this incident, for instance, where she knocked on my door asking for money. I told her, I don't have any money. To which she said, I guess you're a bad minister. It hurt. That day, I did not have the capacity to engage. She hasn't apologized for that one, but I'll let it go. So, neighbors. It can be a hard relationship. I see some head nods out there. It can be a hard relationship. It's not one we always choose. Originally, the word neighbor, as we know it, comes into modern English from Old English. It is a sort of a compound of two words, nigh, which is actually in Old English, N-E-A-H, and E-A-H, which becomes nigh, N-E-I-G-H, in modern English. Same pronunciation, different spelling. Nigh and Gabor. When these words combined, they were used to describe a near-dwelling inhabitant, or a neighbor. It should be noted that historically, when this word first really began to be used, it was only used to describe working folks. Some uses of the word Gabor, for instance, are translated as peasant or farmer. These near-dwellers weren't nobility, but rather people who worked in the fields, plied their trades, or otherwise carved out an existence within the working class fabric of society. In time, this understanding has expanded, as words often do, and today we generally think of neighbors being the people who live next to us in an apartment, or across the street, or even down the road. Maybe we think of neighbors as being something even farther. Being a good neighbor, though, however we define it, is like any other relationship. It requires work and maintenance, and that work cannot be one-sided. It needs to be mutual. When these relationships aren't based in mutuality, we end up in situations like I described at the beginning of this sermon, where we don't communicate with each other and lash out. This mutuality doesn't mean we need to always agree or even get along, but rather is about acknowledging how my life and actions impact the people who live around me, the people I interact with, those who come in and out of our life, sometimes not by choice. Recently, I noticed a phenomena happening in my front yard: dog poop. I first noticed it one morning when I was going out to my car, and as I was getting in, I stepped in it. I was pretty pissed and walked around the back of the house to the sliding door, opened it up, kicked my shoes off, went inside, changed into a different pair of shoes, said I'll fix that later, went back out, got in my car, and went to work. A few days later, a friend was leaving my house after stopping by and hanging out for a little while. It was nighttime, and as they were going out to their car, they stepped in another pile. This was curious to me because I have 2 dogs, and I'll be honest, I'm not always the best about cleaning up in my backyard, but that's the thing. There's a reason my backyard's fenced, and the dogs always kind of go in one corner, and I know not to go walking out there. I don't let them go in the front yard. Whose dog was pooping in my yard? A few days later, hanging out with the neighbors. All the neighbors were there, mostly. And I just casually mentioned, hey, has anyone been noticing the dog poop that's been showing up in the yard? My neighbor Jen, who we are probably the closest with Jen and her family, said, yeah, the other day the kids were playing in the yard and there was poop everywhere. It's like, have you seen whose dog it is? She goes, I think it's the new tenant who moved in next door. I hadn't met Julia really yet. We had kind of briefly said hi, and I really didn't want the first interaction to be that guy coming over complaining about your dog pooping in my yard. He said, I felt a little embarrassed about this. Like, what kind of neighbor? This is how we start our relationship. And Jen, who lives on the other side and whose kids had stepped in it, said, I've got this. And Jen is great. She's a great diplomat. And she played blocker and went and talked with Julia. And now we've talked about it. It's all sorted out. I haven't seen poop in my front yard in a few months now. I'll take it. In all of these neighborly experiences, the theme that has been a constant is a willingness to reach out and to remain in relationship even when it is hard and challenging, even if sometimes we need others to be there with us or to run blocker. It's hard to ask for assistance. It's hard to say that we need help. But that's the thing about being a neighbor. We need each other. Our lives are woven together. When someone is hurting, it impacts us all. Whenever we talk about our interconnection, this is what we are talking about. We have discovered how disregarding our relationship with the natural world around us, with the environment, brings harm. We've discovered that. What harm follows when we disregard our relationships between the people we live near? One belief of mine that I have held for probably longer than any other is that I believe that systems of different magnitudes mirror each other. William Blake once described this phenomena saying, "To see the world in a grain of sand and heaven in a wildflower, to hold infinity in the palm of your hand and eternity in an hour." Metaphysical thinkers have described this view with adages like, "As above, so below," and "Microcosm is macrocosm." To me, these things are all ways of saying that we are deeply connected, such that what touches one affects us all. Our relationships matter. Relationships transform us. And when we can continue to engage and be in relationship, I believe we are doing that most holy work that we are called to. The work of building the beloved community, where each of us is seen, where everyone is celebrated, and every person belongs. May we be inspired to be such good neighbors to each other and to those beyond. May it be so. I'd like to invite you all to rise as you are willing and able as we prepare to sing our closing hymn of our service in the Teal hymnal, hymn number 1008, When Our Heart is in a Holy Place, which is our hymn of the month.
So we're going to sing this all the way through, and then one bonus time, we're going to sing the first verse again. The hope is that we all know this really well by now, and that maybe some of you can like put the hymnal down and just, go all the way with it. I don't know that I would join you in that. It's so long.
That's okay.
It's a little challenging, but anyway, there we go.
That was pretty rockin' for a hymn. Please repeat after me as I extinguish our flaming chalice. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth. The warmth of community or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again.
Our service has ended, but our service to the world and one another begins anew. May we go forth inspired to be good neighbors to those people in our lives and be transformed by those relationships we share. May it be so.